And so what I realized is that if you work in growth, there's two fundamental components I think everyone needs to master. The first is growth strategy. What to do, what good looks like, resources that you need, goals, milestones, etc. The second is how to get it done, how to actually implement this stuff, how to execute at early stage startup scale-ups. And that's kind of my background. And so I stumbled into this thing that I call the growth operating system. It's really a toolkit for people who are leading the growth capability so that they can be more effective in their roles and navigate some of the stuff that stops us, which is typically the pushback from lack of alignment, lack of explanation, and all that kind of stuff.
Hello. Welcome to ThriveCast. We are now on episode 64. I'm very proud of it now. And today we are doing a deep dive with a good friend of mine. His name is Andrew Capland. We've done a podcast with him before. He is one of the best in the industry when it comes to product activation, retention, and recently he's been, he's kicked off a new project called Growth Operating System. We're going to go deep dive into it. There's some tidbits about Andrew that I have been loving for some time, especially his story. He was a growth marketer. I'm not sure which company it was where he used to get a lot of free users come through the door, but the entire leadership team was very disconnected with conversions, activations, and retentions. So he was a problem solver, figured out how to go analyze the user journey, what they like, what they don't like, where they drop off. And he soon became a champion of building a growth operating system for that particular company. I think maybe that's the opposition that he's bringing to the table. Andrew, welcome to the podcast. Could you share a little bit about how did you start off with the growth operating system? What was the pains that, led you to think about something like this, especially with your background?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the kind words. So in general, what I have found in my own journey, I spent a lot of time when I first got into growth, I was a growth marketer, kind of slowly starting to dip my toes a little bit more into the activation side of growth and kind of getting into product growth and some retention stuff and all of that. And I found that I invested all of my time in learning what to do. I took Reforge. If you go on YouTube, there's like all these old, amazing conference talks that are on there. And I just became obsessed with like learning the tactics and the playbooks and what the best operators were doing out there. And basically at my company, I just copied all that stuff. And I was like, oh, well, let me just try to do that here. Or this person says to run this kind of test. I should do that at my company. What I kind of learned was the ideas were commodities. There was a lot of them. Some of them were good. A lot of them were contextual. And you kind of learn that in this space. But my challenge was really execution. It wasn't figuring out where in the model to focus or what good looked like. That content was readily available. My challenge was, how do I get the head of product on board? They're kind of pushing back on my ideas. And how do I explain this in a way that my executives understand? Like, they didn't watch the conference talk that I watched. They don't understand all the terminology and the jargon and all that stuff. And I was having a hard time translating things that I believed to be true in a way that others understood. And so I was getting pushback on resources, and I was feeling stressed out that I wasn't able to make more progress and to move faster. And when I started scaling my own team, I was like, well, why haven't you guys watched the conference talks? How do you not know how to do this stuff? And what do you mean you don't know what an experiment doc is? And so what I realized is that if you work in growth, there's two fundamental components I think everyone needs to master. The first is growth strategy. What to do, what good looks like, resources that you need, goals, milestones, etc. The second is how to get it done, how to actually implement this stuff, how to execute at early stage startup scale-ups. And that's kind of my background. And so I stumbled into this thing that I call the growth operating system. It's really a toolkit for people who are leading the growth capability so that they can be more effective in their roles and navigate some of the stuff that stops us, which is typically the pushback from lack of alignment, lack of explanation, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Andrew, this is beautiful. I'll tell you why. There are so many companies, so many products out there in trying to build a growth operating system as a tooling. Tooling can only go so far. You can say, hey, here's my North Star metric, here's my analytics, go figure it out. I think what you're building is phenomenal. You're essentially connecting the dots between, hey, here's the metrics, here's how you should think about it, here's how the correlations are happening to it, and which is why you should go if you fix this, it's like a playbook that you're now starting to write. There's nothing like this that's available in the market. And that's phenomenal. More so because I think, and for all the listeners, you can go to his website and we'll put that in the show notes as well. There are so many silos, Andrew, that you are now collapsing. You are collapsing, the traditional silos of the product analytics, which was its own beast, marketing analytics, which was its own beast. They would not talk to each other. Sales analytics, revenue analytics, retention or churn analytics. Right? There's so many, or at least 5 or 6 different analytics products, which were focused purely on those silos. And I think you have figured out how to really stitch them together at the company level. Maybe could you share a little bit about, maybe even, not necessarily a case study, but who would use something like this? They might already have so many tool sets, so many analytics tools. Who would use your product? How do you go approach them? Who are these people who would essentially lap your framework and then,
Yeah.
love it?
Yeah. So this is really a leadership framework. So if you are leading the growth capability, it's probably a good match in terms of the stuff that you're facing and helping you to navigate some of the common missteps in the role. And I learned about this just because I felt like, I knew what to do a lot of the time, but I wasn't always effective in getting it done. And so I kind of learned how important this stuff is. And really what I've realized is when you become the head of the growth capability, whether your title is director, VP, head of, it doesn't really matter. If you're leading a growth team, whether it's a team of 1 or a team of 15 or whatever, typically what happens when you get into that seat for the first time, I've been starting to think about the career as a set of ladders. I used to think it was one ladder, right? You climb up the career, some people call it the totem pole, but like you go kind of one rung at a time, every promotion, you take another step. What I've learned is that it's actually not really the right frame to think about. I think about it as multiple ladders. So when you're a contributor, individual or on a team, you're starting and you master your craft, you're at the top of that ladder, right? There's mastery in what growth frameworks, growth execution, all that stuff. But when you start leading the growth capability, what you realize is now you're on a new ladder and you're on the bottom rung. And there's this whole skill set you need to learn to climb that ladder. How to share your ideas in a way that are compelling for others, how to advocate for the resources that you need, how to deal with pushback with other teams, how to draw lines in between, of ownership and accountability between marketing and growth and product. And if you have a sales team, with sales team, how to share decision-making frameworks so that your team can execute, so you don't have to be involved in everything. And so those were just things I've learned in this journey myself. And I've been working as a coach supporting other people who are leading the growth capability. I've worked with probably 80 or 85 other growth leaders out there. And I realized I was basically working on the same things with everybody. It was like every single person, this kind of stuff, the order was different depending on the individual and their circumstance and their personal skill set. But basically, I'd cover all this stuff in some way, shape, or form. And so along the way, I made a cheat sheet for myself. And it was like, oh, at some point, people are going to ask me about this. They're going to deal with issues with their counterparts leading these other teams. And when that comes up, here's how I'm going to talk about it with them. And, through repetition, I refined that. And eventually I realized that there was a product here for folks, whether I was working with them or not, that could be helpful and supportive. And that's more or less what I did. I productized a lot of the things that I was doing with my one-on-one clients in a way that could be helpful for folks. Maybe they're not quite ready to work with me. Maybe they don't want to work with me, but they just want the game. And so I tried to detail it all out.
What I'm amazed of this is I know there are, you focus a lot more on building those artifacts, the frameworks, the decision-making things. Would you ever fear that ChatGPT might take that away from you? What do you think is happening? And I know this is a slight diversion, but most of these frameworks are now available. Product-led frameworks, you can ask ChatGPT to go build an entire growth strategy for you, right? And you can tweak it. You can do that. What's so different about about your approach than a tooling based, Gen AI based, a RAG or summarization of these things? Where do you see, why do growth leaders want something like this? I mean, they can have access to all these tool sets. Why would, do you think that it is the personal coaching that's missing? They may not have the right North Star in their own head on how to approach this. They don't necessarily know what's the next step, to get to the goal. Is that how you think about this?
There's a huge difference between knowing what to do in an academic vacuum and dealing with the outcome and being in the trenches, basically, is what I've realized. Huge difference. You can talk to GPT, and if you ask it specific questions, it might flag some of this stuff. But it's way different than when you're sitting in the meeting and you're getting the pushback from your CEO and, you've presented what you thought was a good model, but it landed flat, and now people are poking over your shoulder. Well, why are you doing this, and why are you doing that? And I don't understand how this hire is going to ladder up to the broader picture. And what are we even working towards here? What's like the 3-year vision? Until you've been in the trenches and like had to crawl your way out of that type of scenario, I've just learned it's a huge difference. It's kind of like folks that go to business school before they've been, kind of in the industry for a little bit. They talk about it. This is literally why I started coaching. I took Reforge, which is incredible. I love the Reforge team. I've gotten to be a guest lecturer over the last couple of years. I can't say enough beautiful things about their team. That's where you go to learn about growth. And I came out of Reforge, chest up, chin up, feeling like I knew exactly what to do. And then again, I had trouble being effective. And so there's sort of a difference. On my own podcast, one of my guests shared there's a difference between being right and being effective. And so I really focus on helping people be effective. Yeah. And the only way you can learn to be effective is if you've, one, not been effective, and then two, had to figure out how to be effective after struggling to be effective. And today the robots can only help you with so much of that journey. And what I've learned recently, my business has exploded over the past 4 months or so. Business has always been good. I've been on my own about 4 years. And what I think is happening is I think people are realizing how important it is to have somebody to talk to like share this stuff. And I don't know what the future will look like, but I think that there's real value in having a human who's in your corner, who has real emotions that can help you to understand what's going on and how to fix it. And so I've seen my business grow, even though AI adoption is, in theory, should be a threat to me and my business. It has not been. If anything, it's accelerated mine, which has been cool.
I can certainly see you might be the Deloitte or the KPMG or the McKinsey, for a growth business sometime soon. So I want to jump into a few more things. In one of the things that you mentioned, even to me personally, on the last call, and about North Star metrics, and you and I, we had some debates on what kind of North Star metrics people are applying or companies are applying. Any thoughts? And I want to lead that to primarily a question about pushbacks, especially, let's say, if a growth leader or sales leader is looking at a revenue metric. How do you essentially coach him to say, hey, revenue is nothing but a lagging indicator? You have other leading indicators that if you solve that, over time, you might lead, to the output of revenue. Do you see there is pushback from various growth leaders in this figuring out what the growth star metrics might be?
A lot of times folks need help defining or refining, I guess, what their North Star metric would be, but typically they understand that the output that their boss cares about. Let me actually rephrase. I think there's a difference between what your boss cares about at the organizational level and what you need to care about at the capability level. So most of the folks who I support understand at the company level that their boss and the board and the execs talk in terms of revenue. But when they work with their team, they need to think in terms of the inputs to that outcome. And so the inputs typically are some North Star metric related to either activation or retention or both. And so I work with a lot of teams that understand that philosophically, but maybe they need help educating the C-suite on, like, here's why this is important for our team, or yes, we're going to report in terms of this, but internally our North Star is going to be this. And here's the connection between those two things and why it matters. And here's maybe the strategy that I've got and how it ladders up to that, which is ultimately going to be in support of our revenue goals and things like that. So there's almost like two languages that you need to speak. And this is one of the challenges of working in growth. You need to speak the language that your execs care about, which is revenue and number of customers and rate of growth. And then you also need to speak in the language of actionable and execution to lead your team at the capability level. And typically, that's activation and in retention metrics.
And retention.
Yeah.
So I have a question around the pushbacks. I mean, very likely you might be encountering this in your business as well. If your boss is a sales leader, then he's going to look after the revenue and the customers. But if your boss is a marketer, he's going to look at vanity metrics. We recently had a conversation with one of our customers, and the marketing guy, the chief marketing officer, essentially became the growth officer. And he's looking purely at the vanity metrics, a number of visitors, what's the repeat visitors, what's the free to paid conversion, and then they would stop at that particular place. What you're mentioning here is activation retention, which is far down the line of their purview. Do you encounter pushbacks in the kind of roles people will have in, because I think, as you're working with the growth leaders, the people below the organization, who's reporting to them will have a different set of outcomes that they want to get, right? And they may not necessarily be revenue, because the revenue is, again, a how do you coach the team below the organization to start thinking differently, that hey, this is how your primary north star metric would be, and if you're able to achieve this in 3 months time, 6 months time, you will start hitting the revenue goals that you have.
I think you've got to, yeah, you got to start with a model. The model can be qualitative to begin with, which just shows like, how does somebody go, if it's a product led organization, how does somebody go from the website into our lead flow? Where are the moments where we might segment between, if we're a hybrid organization with a sales team versus completely product or or self-service, kind of where do we go? What are the moments of segmentation? What are the milestones of that activation, of retention? And again, there are slight nuances if it's a free trial or freemium motion, but what are kind of the big milestone moments and where do the conversions happen? So I think everybody should start with a qualitative picture of what that looks like, and then a quantitative outlook that actually shows what are the conversion rates, what are the growth rates, what are we looking at kind of month over month, quarter over quarter, year over year for the data that we have, and then using that to set goals for your team. But you've got to educate them on those first two things. And I think it's the leader's responsibility to also let them know, hey, internally, we're going to talk about these metrics, but externally, like when we share at the company level, they care about this. Even just that framing, I think, is really helpful. Like one of the real tactical things that anybody can do, I encourage everybody who works in growth to always be sharing at the company level, right? Sharing what you're working on, how it's going, what's coming next, that kind of stuff. Even if you're not being prompted to do that, that should be a proactive thing. If you're, if you're a director or a team lead, you should always be doing that. And when you share, what most people do is they get up there and they say, hey, we just launched this really cool website test where we changed the text on the H1 on the homepage. It's really cool. Shout out to James for writing great copy. That's what most folks do. But if you do that exact same thing with a 30-second primer up front, hey, everyone, just a quick reminder, I'm Andrew. I work on growth. Right now, we're hyper-focused on increasing the conversion rate to the website. Here's why that's so important. And a huge part of our operating system is testing before deep commitment and testing before deep polish. Here's a really cool test that we're running right now on the homepage. I'll be excited to share how it goes and the impact that it has on our model and retention and revenue down the road. But for today, shout out to James, wrote some dope copy. Check it out. It's live today, right? It's the same thing, but just a little bit of priming up front. So there's like some small tactical things that you can do that have a huge impact in how others perceive you. So there's like an internal thing, like how do you work with your team? And then a perception component, which is about how others view you and the trust that you build as a team lead and capability lead and things like that.
Yeah. I guess the millennials probably are able to advertise themselves much better, than, the age group that you and we are in. They might find it difficult to go advertise themselves. Hey, I'm working on something like this, and then here's the impact, and hey, shout out to somebody else. I mean, that takes some kind of a priming up. So that's amazing. That's probably why you're a lot more successful in coaching a cross-functional growth team. And I think these are the hallmarks of that. To the listeners, we'll also have this. We'll mark it. We'll probably even clip it towards this. Maybe I want to have a leading question into this. Typically, the companies that you work with, tell me a little bit about the silos they operate in. When I think we touched upon that a little bit, right? So the marketing is a silo, sales is a silo, revenue is a silo, customer success or retention or churn is a silo. How do you advise? What is it that you would have? Maybe even a short advice on what should they do within the silos, but how should they bubble up everything up to to a growth framework level that you would evangelize with them.
Just want to make sure I understand the question before I go into autopilot here. So you're wondering, how do we make sure that everybody's collaborating together for the common good? Is that sort of the question?
Correct, because they may not understand it. That's the common good that they want to drive to. The goals that the growth leaders at the top might have is all about revenue, it's all about customers, it's all about that. But that correlation, somebody needs to draw that up. Is that why they would look for outside help, or like the Andrew Capland McKinsey kind of a company seeking help in figuring out, hey, how do I translate from my goals if I'm a growth leader to the team goals, and how should they operate? And break the silos around that.
I think at most companies, there's a fundamental or like philosophical agreement typically in kind of what needs to be done. Let's use a real example. So let's say I'm working with a scale up. They've got, I don't know, 10 million in revenue. They're looking to get to 40 million in revenue in the next period of time. So they're in this stage. At that stage of company growth, typically you have siloed teams, or you're starting to have siloed teams, right? In the really early stage, maybe sub 4 million, 3 million, everyone's kind of working in the same room if you're in person type of a thing. And so the collaboration happens really naturally. But at some point of company maturity, you start to get a little bit more specialization. You get someone who's leading marketing, someone who's leading product. Maybe you've got this kind of cross-functional growth team that's starting to kind of form in the middle. Again, if you have a sales-led or hybrid organization, maybe there's a sales leader as well. And at some point, the leaders understand at the company level, we need to get more of our new users to, say you have a free trial, engage in that free trial motion. So marketing goes out and they say, well, on the marketing side, we can adjust our email flows, and maybe we'll make a really cool help center page and we can link to it in the email flows. And maybe we've got a tool like Appendo or something like that, and we can communicate to folks when they're browsing around during their free trial. And then the sales team goes out and they go, yeah, what are ways that we can get more folks to engage? Well, we can send them our own one-to-one emails and we can look at this trigger in our CRM. They go do their thing. And the product team goes out and they start working on stuff. And what happens, so everybody philosophically understands, like, hey, we all kind of need to work on this thing. And they know philosophically, we should probably talk to each other, right? Like product, we should probably meet with marketing to like have them look over the copy. But typically what happens is, in my experience, is they do it the opposite way of what I would advocate for. So what I would advocate for is, if you're going to go off in your silos, meet during the first 20% of like scoping and alignment, make sure it's really clear who owns what, who should be collaborating with who's ultimately responsible for the metric, who you need to collaborate to, who should be informed about the updates you're making. So getting really, really clear on that stuff. Most of the teams skip that. So they just start working on stuff. They execute for some period of time, and then they pop their head up and inform everybody about the changes they've made. And then the other team goes, fuck, now I got to redo everything. That doesn't make sense. It's a different screenshot. I didn't know that change was coming. Who approved that? It's just a fucking mess. And so they spend the last 10% trying to redo everything and make sure it's all aligned, when they could have avoided all that by getting up front. So one of the easiest, like most tactical things that you can do is, if you're working on stuff like this, philosophically, y'all know we need to work together on something, but we don't really know how to work together on it. One of the easiest places to start is to create a RACI matrix. So RACI matrix is just a way for teams to work together effectively, especially cross-functional teams. So it's an acronym, RACI. R is who's responsible, typically who's responsible for like doing the thing. A is who's accountable. Typically that's like, the boss who owns the metric. C is who should you consult with, or who should be consulted on the work that you're doing. And I is who should be informed about it and kept in the loop. So if you spend a little bit of time before you get in the weeds doing that, maybe you identify a couple folks you need to consult with. They flag anything that might have been misaligned or doesn't make sense, or is going to be conflicting or overlapping from a user perspective, and you get ahead of all that. If you don't, typically you know this because you've been in a meeting and you look, somebody signs up for the product for the first time in a month, and you get 6 emails in the first 2 days, and 3 are from the sales team and 2 are from the marketing team. And then the product team went and they built one from, their backend tool that auto triggers when you get to some point, and the user experience typically is what suffers. And so you don't notice it until later, where eventually it's reflected in your conversion or retention rates. And these are very natural challenges that happen as you start to get specialization in organizations.
So let me understand this a little more. So the way that you think about advising them is, go first do a quick powwow on what's your growth levers would be, even though you didn't use that word. I'm just adding from my side. What are growth levers? What experiments you should be doing, and how do they correlate to the primary goal, which could be revenue, customers, and all of that? And do you see this often in $5 to $10 million ARR company, where they are doing the powwow? They're essentially having some kind of a scorecard. They meet on a regular basis. Or is that a missing thing altogether?
It's typically missing.
It's missing. Okay.
Yeah. I would say 4 times out of 5, it's missing. And I'm biased, right? So I'm working with companies that are facing challenges. They're looking to fix them. So I'm not 4 out of 5 that I get to chat with, but I think it's really common where you track the KPIs that are traditional KPIs to track in your silo, and you own the areas of the growth model that are traditional areas for you to own. And what makes it tricky is, if you need to work cross-functionally for the benefit of your organization, most companies don't really have a good system to do that. So that's a lot of the work that I do.
Got it. Okay. I think it looks like you have a very similar playbook to what McKinsey does. I was on the other side of McKinsey. I was at Microsoft, and McKinsey would come in. They would sit down with us, conduct a half a day or one whole day workshop. Just the the concept of how to do certain things. Here's a business market, here's how you should do it, and then assign, or create a growth scorecard. In this case, that, hey, this is how you should measure it, and then go ahead and assign people, to each one of them at the lower order of the business. Looks like your playbook is very McKinsey-ish. So compliments on that.
I got to increase the prices, baby.
You should. So let me check on a few more things. You mentioned that AI in growth is may not necessarily take this away, because you have to go coach people, and people are really looking for a person, a leader who knows their stuff. They can come in and whisper in their ears. Typically, that's where they want it. What happens when someone like you stops consulting them? You finish the work. Do they go back to the same old mess that they were earlier? Or usually, do you have to be, is there someone needs to be like constantly prodding them, prepping them, hey, this is what you should do next month, this is what you should do in this quarter?
It's a really good question. If I am really effective in supporting a team, I should probably work myself out of a job, right? I'm going to teach them the systems and the frameworks and the tools, and I'm going to help them set up the rituals and the meeting structure and the sharing cadence and all that stuff. And in theory, I'm good to go. In the best case scenario, what happens is I support a team that's in a hyper growth stage. And so when I stay on, it's typically because the rate of growth and the rate of change is just so great, and the team is growing at a clip where things are just constantly changing. And so they need to reevaluate that playbook maybe every 6 months or so. And we're not drastically overhauling things, but the way that you lead a 3-person team is different than a 7-person team. And a 7-person team is different than a 20-person team. And, when you get to a 60-person team and you've got kind of like, 4 lieutenants, for lack of a better word, kind of reporting up to you, leading, smaller functional squads, the playbook for that is a little bit different as well. And maybe you're teaching those team leads to create their own scorecards and their own operating systems that are unique to their own capabilities. And so when I stay on for longer, it's usually for that. It's usually to help someone so that the opportunity doesn't outgrow their skill set. And so what I've learned, and I've gotten to work with certain folks for, probably like 3 years at this point. And when I've asked them, like, hey, what's the value of us working together? They're like, you have no idea how helpful it is to sit down with someone. My boss has never done my job before. They've never led a cross-functional thing. They come from this, the marketing or the product side. So they haven't done my job. I don't have someone else who can sit next to me, look at what I'm doing, and either say, hey, you're on the right path, keep going, or hey, it looks like you missed something. Let's workshop it together and figure it out. And that's a lot of what I'll get to do for some of my longer term clients. And as you know, if you stay in a role long enough, you hit all kinds of crazy challenges that you have no training for. And that's like the fun and the crazy part about working at early stage companies. And some of these AI startups are on this growth trajectory that I feel like we haven't seen in tech probably in about 10 years. And so those folks are trying to figure out, how do I make sure I don't get leveled? And I need help constantly upskilling, because the job is just changing in real time. And so some of the longer term clients are in those environments.
So you brought up the subject of AI. Let me ask that a little bit. Do you see AI is changing the product market fit for the companies that you typically advise? Meaning they may or may not have had AI there, but some competition comes in, makes it a lot more easier, a lot more natural language, get information to their fingertips rather than going through a SaaS product, click, do this, get notifications, dashboards, and all of that. Do you see companies coming out of product market fit much faster now because of all of the AI race that's happening?
Yes. And let me preface it by saying I'd never seen that before. Like, I've worked in the tech world since 2009. And so I've seen some of the startups kind of come up and grow, and some get acquired and some disappear. I've never seen a company that seemed like, from an employee perspective, a safe place to work, a place that had scale, that had product market fit. I've never seen a company lose it before. I've seen it twice in the past 6-8 months, maybe in the past year. I don't want to share too much about the companies. I'm under confidentiality stuff, but companies that, one was just what I would consider a pretty traditional software company that had a very specific use case, a high volume product-led business that had a low average revenue per customer and a lot of customers. Suddenly there were some changes that came out that sort of made their product obsolete. And, it's not like the company went to zero overnight, but internally they realized we need to pivot and we need to figure it out quick. And so they were kind of under a code red on the leadership team to switch things up. And it was stressful for that leader. I was supporting them throughout that. They told me they weren't sleeping well. They were really stressed. When your title is head of growth and the company stops growing, you feel that at an identity level that's different. I'm sure at a founder level, you feel it, the most, of course, but when your title's growth and you stop growing, like that's a big deal in your life. And then the same thing with another company in the educational space. So they have education products, and they were just seeing that things were slowing down, and that, especially since you sell to the, the younger generation, that they were just consuming information differently. And it happened, that change happened really quick. And so again, the company will survive this. They're not in a code red, but they're shifting their model so that they can adapt. And I just had never seen that before.
Yeah, I think it's happening much more rapidly. You're absolutely right. It's happening a lot more rapidly now. We had a few customers who had at least they told us that they were achieved product market fit. We are an growth analytics company. We deployed a product to them. We have a PMS scorecard, and then we say, hey, let's measure every segment. So segment 1, segment 2, segment 3. Let's see whether you're at PMF. When we deployed that scorecard to them, for the SMB, high velocity, self-serve kind of a segment, they were PMF, but the mid-market, and the upselling motions and the enterprise motions, they were not, right? So, and when we looked at the churn rate, massively big, somewhere upwards of about 7 to 10% month over month churn. And then we drew up the graph saying that, hey, if you keep on adding more, and then you have about 7 to 10%, let's say take an average of 8.5%, here's where you would be. And just looking at that data, they were actually very surprised that they would not grow. And of course, if I knew you at that time, I'd say, hey, Andrew, can you help them?
I don't know if I can help them, man. Well, maybe back then, but if you lose product market fit, you got to fix the foundation,
Yeah, yeah. So tell me a little more about your own journey. I think you were, some time back we talked about that you were a growth marketer, and then you learned your way in figuring out activation. And then I think you made a very specific comment that if you become a problem expert, you automatically get pulled into a solution expert. Could you maybe share a little more insights on, what that means, and what would you recommend other growth leaders to be able to go figure out and become that problem expert?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll share the takeaway and then I'll share the journey. So the takeaway is the person closest to the problem tends to get trusted to implement the best solution, regardless if they actually know the best solution today.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned this because I was an acquisition marketer. Like I was kind of your classic technical marketer, a mix of demand gen and marketing operations. And I was kind of the A/B testing guy, amongst other things, kind of like the numbers technical marketer. And I did a lot of A/B testing to acquire more signups. And, if you do that for long enough, typically you get more signups. And I saw that those signups weren't flowing through really to the bottom line, to revenue, right? So I actually learned this the hard way. Again, a lot of what I've learned through making mistakes. So literally I got up in front of the company. I said, hey, we've been running all these tests. We've increased the number of signups on a monthly basis by 15%. Can you believe that? Look at this number. Rah, rah, go me, more or less. And then quietly, my manager, who is the chief operating officer at one point, pulled me aside and he was like, it's great that you're doing that. It seems like you're learning some cool stuff, but be careful about how loud you're yelling about these wins because we haven't really moved the needle on the revenue number yet. Why do you think that is? So it's like a valuable lesson. And so what I learned just becoming interested in it is that the signups were shitty signups. They were signing up, they weren't doing anything, and they were just leaving. And so I became obsessed with what happened after they signed up. And by obsessed, what I mean is I started watching session recordings. I started spending a lot of time playing around in the data, asking folks if anyone was paying attention or trying to have any goals for when people signed up. Like, what did good sign up usage look like over the first couple of days? Things like that. Nobody really had the answers. And so just because I'm, obsessive, I just dove in and I loved it. And eventually I started learning stuff and asking questions, and I became the guy who knew a lot of information about that. And eventually becoming, the person who understood that problem the most, I surfaced that it was a big problem and I modeled out how it would impact the business if it was improved. And that eventually got me resources and a team and helped me to transition from being a marketer to working cross-functionally on product growth problems. And so whenever someone comes to me and they're like, hey, I'm a marketer, how do I get into product? I've been blocked out of product. I want to get into being a growth PM. How can I do that? I share a longer version of what I shared with you, and then we game plan out what that could look like for them and what opportunities are, available at their organization, in their context, with their team, and all that stuff.
That's a very inspiring story. I think to the listeners, I think Andrew is probably an embodiment of what he's saying. Be the problem expert. So you automatically become a solution expert. I think our human brains are wired in such a way that if you understand the problem, you can actually go figure out the solution. But if you're focusing purely on the solution, you'll actually not really solve anything.
Yep. And it's actually the same for marketing any product, right? Even my growth OS, like if you go to the landing page right now, all I do is I talk about the challenges that folks who lead the growth capability face. We talked about a lot of them today. And because I can articulate those challenges, because I've lived them, right? It's not me guessing on the challenges. Like I know the challenges. I've had the sleepless nights. I've had the anxiety. I've had to learn to meditate and to deal with the inner game, to navigate and to learn these skills. Probably you trust that, hey, probably there's some information this person might have that would be helpful. And the same is for all the products, I feel like, that scale to become big businesses. You market the product, and if you do a good job with that, people will trust that eventually your product is good enough that it will deliver.
So
it's sort of like the category creation playbook, I feel like, in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I think I attended one of your lectures at the Forge, and I think it was one of those around category creation, acquisition, activation, all of that. I have a couple of questions before we end this. Could you maybe share a little bit about what the growth operating system is? And you mentioned about the components associated to it. You said there's a strategy component, there's an operational or playbook component. Where can the listeners actually go download this? What will they get from it? And maybe if you can close it on, how can they actually reach out to you to be able to go seek help? Essentially, you're a growth doctor.
Better than a growth therapist. Sometimes folks say, you're like my growth therapist. I'm like, I guess I was a doctor, Anyone's interested in connecting with me, LinkedIn's the easiest way. LinkedIn.com/Andrew Capland is where we can connect. There's also a link to my growth OS in there. If you want to go directly to the URL, it's deliveringvalue.co, which is my website /OS. It'll redirect you to the right page. So deliveringvalue.co /OS. What's in it is a collection. Well, it's first of all, it's on school. So there's a mix of curriculum and a community that's in there, so you can ask questions in a closed confidential space amongst your peers and things like that. But it's basically a mix of components teaching you a lot of the things that we talked about today, breaking down team operating values, the way that you can work cross-functionally, what KPIs to track, how often you should be sharing, how to run your team meetings. Basically everything you need to avoid all the stuff we talked about today is included in there. I've got a template library. So if you want to improve your experimentation programs, I've got all my greatest hits in there, tracking docs, and some strategy templates if you want help translating your growth ideas in a way that your execs will understand. So that's what's in the Growth OS. You can check it all out, deliveringvalue.co /OS. If you have questions, reach out and ask me. Or if you're looking for more one-to-one guided support, it's a lot of what I do as a coach as well.
Absolutely. I think to all the listeners, there's a deliveringvalue.com. Please don't go to that.
I couldn't afford the .com,
So .co/OS, and we'll put that in the show notes there. Andrew, one last question. Would they just have to buy the template libraries and the whole package there, or do they also buy and being able to consult with you? How does that typically work?
Yeah. So if anyone if you want to work with me, I include access to the OS as some self-guided curriculum that supplements our one-to-one conversations. It just helps you accelerate everything. But yeah, it's a standalone product. It is a for sale product. So it's $497 is the cost of the OS, which I think for what I put in there is probably undercharging, but that's what I charge. I'm trying to help more people. But no, I got a bunch of free game that's online. So if you go to my website, deliveringvalue.co, I've got a free 5-day email program. I've got a guide for heads of growth. I've got templates if you're starting a new growth job, how to navigate your first 90 days. That's all free. You can consume all that stuff. I hope you do. I hope you like it. Follow me on LinkedIn. I'm always posting stuff about leading growth capabilities and how to scale. So I got lots of free stuff out there, and I'm starting to dabble a little bit more on YouTube, so you can follow me there as well. There's plenty of places to consume free growth content. And if you want the premium stuff, obviously I've shared how to grab it.
Okay, there you go. You heard it from the growth OG himself, Andrew Capland. Thank you so much for taking the time today. And as part of the show notes, we'll have the links to your to the operating system, the growth operating system, as well as any other freebies or any other value that you can provide. We can add that there. Again, thank you so much, Andrew. It's always a pleasure to learn from you and hear so many wonderful things that's happening in your life there.
Appreciate it. Thanks.